in our midst this afternoon, and indeed we are privileged for your presence here, Mr. Terry Tselane, who's executive chairperson of the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa, for short AIMSA. We must first thank you for your written submission, and thank you again this morning for your presentation slides, and both have reached me. I don't have to define the task at hand. You are a very seasoned manager of elections in your own right and an expert in the field. There is a threat to life and limb posed by the pandemic. And the question is whether that ought to translate into limitations in exercising our political rights, and foremost of which would be our electoral rights, or in short, are we limited to advancing our democratic project? And we need assistance from experts. This morning we had 2 health scientists, and now we're really turning to electoral scientists so that we can take guidance from people like yourself. And we also thank you for coming in person. It gets lonely here because we look at screens and talk to each other at some distance. So I'm going to really turn it over to you and listen, and allow me to interrupt from time to time. Judges can't resist doing that. But again, welcome, and we're grateful for your interest and support.
Thank you very much, Justice Moseneke and the team. It's a great honor and a privilege for us to be here, to be making a contribution to an important task for our country. And I must commend the Electoral Commission first for the step that they've taken to initiate this inquiry. It is a very important step indeed. But perhaps even more important that they have actually taken a person of your caliber to head this inquiry with integrity or credentials as a jurist, well respected internationally, as well as a person who has got a track record in the management of the elections. Having said that, I think it is important for me to state from the outset something that is much more obvious, that the country is in the middle of a pandemic. The Premier of Gauteng, Mr. Nakur, has captured it aptly by saying the house is on fire. And recently again, the President imposed restrictions on gatherings, and these restrictions imposed on gatherings will further affect preparations for elections. The COVID-19 infection rates and deaths have skyrocketed. The majority of people who are vulnerable to infection fall within the category of voters. And in no country, even though there are countries that have had elections during the COVID, there is no country that has had elections within a context of gatherings being restricted. All of them, you look at Malawi, the political gatherings were allowed. They could have rallies in stadiums, they could have rallies everywhere. So it will be for the first time probably since this COVID started that we're having an election when there are restrictions that are actually imposed on certain rights for political parties as well as for individuals. But because we are here to deal with the issue of free and fair elections, I think it's important just to remind ourselves by quoting what the Constitutional Court said during the calm judgment. And this is what the Constitution says on free and fair election. I quote, whether any election can be so characterized must always be assessed in context. Ultimately, it involves a value judgment. The following elements can be distilled as being of fundamental importance to the conduct of free and fair elections. First, every person who is entitled to vote should, and if possible, be registered to do so. Second, no one who is not entitled to vote should be permitted to do so. Third, insofar as elections have a territorial component, as is the case with municipal elections, where candidates are in the first instance elected to represent particular wards, the registration of voters must be undertaken in such a way as to ensure that only voters in that particular area are registered and permitted to vote. Fourth, the Constitution projects not only the act of voting and the outcome of elections as a candidate and to seek public office. Perhaps an important point that I've got to mention here is the fact that the element that was emerging from the Constitutional Court judgment is the issue of context. Constitutional Court judgment said, in the context of the by-elections in Tlokwe, there are 4 areas that have got to be looked into. And they have outlined those 4 areas as the context of Tlokwe. So this does not mean that it is a conclusive definition of free and fair elections. So we've got to try to find other elements that will help us to be able to define free and fair elections, but using what the Constitutional Court has said, which is what is the context, because that context matters. So I am going to also look at another case in a matter between the Electoral Commission and Aaron Basakan and others. This is what the Constitutional Court also said, I quote, the mere existence of the right to vote without proper arrangement for its effective exercise does nothing for a democracy. It is both empty and useless. The right to free and fair elections underlines the importance of the exercise of the right to vote. The requirement that every election should be fair has implications for the way in which the right to vote can be given more substance, content, and legitimately exercised. There are important constitutional considerations relevant to the design of an electoral system, which include the need to ensure that the election process will be free and fair, and that the results will be both credible and accurate. So as I was suggesting earlier on, that it is important that we look this within the context of what we are currently going through, as well as whether certain rights can actually be exercised. Now there is an important judgment as well that was given by the Electoral Court in a matter of Njabula Robert Nvelase and the African National Congress and others. There the Electoral Court found that the failure by a voter to exercise a vote because of fear and intimidation can affect the legitimacy of an election. The Imbabazane election results in Ward 3 were as a result nullified. And I'm going to indicate why this is important. Because again, it still comes to the issue of the context that the Constitutional Court has said we must look into when we are looking at the issue of whether the elections are free and fair. The appellants have provided some evidence that a number of prospective voters did not exercise the right to vote essentially out of fear. And I emphasize that word, fear of being assaulted or intimidated. Indeed, the majority of them were intimidated by what they saw near the respective police stations and by what they had heard. There are more than 35 deponents who declared that they would have voted for the second appellant in that particular election. Such allegations of assault, intimidation, threats, and declared intentions are undisputed. Now, it means when we look at the issue of the context of where we are, the question that needs to be asked is whether, at the moment, the South African population is at ease about going to the polling stations to go and cast a vote, or whether there is an element of anxiety and fear amongst people as a result of this pandemic. Because the elections are not just about the political parties, they are about the electorate, because it's about the will of the people. The people must be able to express their will without any fear or favor. And the current pandemic, I must say, has instilled a certain element of fear amongst people. And it is not only in terms of the electorate, it is also in terms of those who are going to be managing the elections. Some of those have not as yet been recruited, but of course the Electoral Commission will be going ahead and recruiting people in preparation for the elections. Now, perhaps to try to wrap up this issue of free and fair elections, I'm going to...
Well, before you move away from the fear,
yeah.
Of course the fear has to be reasonable. In other words, it mustn't be overly subjective or fanciful. Now, Mr. Stone, I raised this within the context of evidence earlier by at least 3 scientists that the pandemic is going nowhere in a hurry. It will be here, they think, for quite some time, maybe a few, not only more months, but a few years. What's going to happen, they suggest, is going to be levels of vaccination will drop the mortality, but not necessarily the infection. So you're going to have this threat over some time. How do we gauge whether the fear is reasonable or is overly subjective? Because not any fear, I don't think the court is talking here about any fear. Here it was very objective. People were saying we are being threatened, intimidated. And in this case, how do we deal with the element of fear when the pandemic will be with us for a long time?
Thank you very much, Justice, for raising that particular question. And I agree with you, and then hence, towards the end of my presentation, there are certain recommendations that I'm making which will provide some kind of security in relation to that particular aspect. Because if you look what is happening currently in Europe, people are able to go and watch their favorite teams playing soccer, even without masks. And the reason why this is happening is because the majority of people who go to those stadiums are people who have actually been vaccinated. So the vaccination rollout program is going to be critical in terms of giving a sense of security to people. And I think the fact that the president has also taken this extraordinary step of actually banning gatherings, it is actually testimony of concern and fear that clearly illustrates that something has got to be done about the pandemic. And then in the meantime, whilst the vaccination rollout program is going ahead, the president has decided and felt in his wisdom that it is necessary to impose further restrictions. And therefore, the security of voters will therefore only be guaranteed once the rollout program has actually covered a sizable population, such as it is happening all over the world. But I will be indicating towards the end of my presentation the process that is going to be followed in order to be able to deal with that, so that this is not a fear of not having the elections indefinitely.
Very well, thank you.
Now, I'm going to now talk a little bit about the integrity. We, as the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa, or IMSA, made an analysis and developed a tool that we are using to measure the integrity of the elections. This integrity wheel has taken into consideration quite a number of principles And it actually helps in terms of locating the context that the Constitutional Court talks about. Because in order for the elections to take place, you need basically, or rather for the elections to have integrity, you need essentially 5 elements. And those elements are as follows. The first one is the quality of logistics. And the logistics, I think to a large extent, the Chief Electoral Officer, Simon Mamabolo, was able to take the committee through the logistical preparations. But if the logistics of elections are not properly planned, that has got the capacity to affect the integrity of the elections and ultimately the freeness and the fairness of the elections. The second aspect is human capital. And human capital essentially refers to the capacity of those who are running the elections, whether you have recruited people who've got the capacity, and then those people know exactly what's supposed to be happening at the voting station, they understand the processes, and they are able to run or manage the elections impartially without any fear or favor. The third is the quality of the voters' roll. Now, the voters' roll is quite critical, and I think, again, in the presentation of the CEO, he did indicate the importance of the voters' roll as well as how many people have now been registered. But that area, as we can see, is not yet complete because the IEC still has a registration weekend pending. But the voters' roll and its currency and making sure that those who are contained in a list of the register of people who will be participating in the elections contains only the names of people who are eligible to participate, and that those who are not eligible to participate are not there, as the Constitutional Court has already said. It's quite critical in the preparation for the elections. So at the moment there is an element pertaining to registration, but the voters' roll as it currently stands, and I can say this with confidence because I've been part of the processes in the IEC, it is current minus the issues that they've been dealing with, which relates to the issue of addresses, which the Constitutional Court has already made a judgment on. I'm aware that that process is not complete. The Commission is still trying to finalize that aspect. But the voters' roll is important in terms of determining the integrity of the elections. Any problem with the voters' roll will affect the integrity, as we saw it happening in Tlokwe during the Tlokwe by-elections. And the fourth aspect is the legal framework. The legal framework, obviously, starting from the Constitution. What does the Constitution say? What are the other pieces of legislation saying about preparations for the elections, etc., etc. And I think to a large extent, the IEC has also submitted to Parliament some amendments to certain sections in order to make sure that the legal framework is such that they can actually be able to manage this process with integrity. So the legal framework plays an important role in determining the integrity of the elections, and as I've suggested, consequently the freeness and the fairness of the elections. Now, let's come to the political environment, which is my last point here on the integrity. Political environment encapsulates quite a number of factors. The electoral process, it's a joint responsibility. It's a joint responsibility between the Commission and various stakeholders. The Commission, as per the Constitution, has got the responsibility to organize, manage, and administer the elections. And secondly, to ensure that those elections are free and fair. And thirdly, to declare the results thereof within a reasonable period. That's the core mandate of the Electoral Commission. But the elections can't happen only because the Electoral Commission is ready. It means all other partners who are central in the delivery of the elections must also be able to play their role. Political parties have a role of mobilizing and educating their supporters about electoral processes, the legislation, what it entails. there is a code of conduct that all political parties have got to adhere to. That code of conduct is something that every political party has got to be able to explain to its supporters, so that they do not do things that are incongruent or inconsistent with the code of conduct. In order for them to be able to play this role, it means they must have contact with people. They must be able to talk to people about this. So that process of educating supporters and talking to the electorate, it's quite a key element in in ensuring that the integrity of the elections is protected. But also the electorate, within that particular context, has a responsibility of obviously having to understand the different messages that is being disseminated. There's got to be a process through which they can be able to evaluate information that is coming from different candidates and different political parties. And then here, we're talking about local government elections. And because we're talking about local government elections, it is not only the 13 political parties that are represented in Parliament that are critical. It means a candidate who is contesting a ward in Atteridgeville must be able to reach people and then be able to convince them to vote for them. But because there are different candidates, the electorate must be able to evaluate the messages of different players that are coming to see as to whether that message or whether they can vote for a particular political party or a political candidate or not.
Well, Mr. Tselane, that must be correct. But let's drill a little deeper. Let's start off with the statutory framework, constitutional state framework. Is there any prescribed form of messaging that ought to be available to contestants, to political parties or independent candidates? Does the law prescribe how the messaging should happen? And two, does the messaging change depending on the context, material conditions that exist, in the context of the integrity wheel that is so helpful that I've put before us? How do we deal with that? To wrap up, is messaging required by law in a particular form? And two, does context change the nature and perhaps the frequency and the content of the messaging?
Thank you very much, Justice, for that question. Of course, the law does not prescribe how the messaging has got to happen. However, the law does protect an individual or does give an individual the rights to be able to have access to information. So, and then also the political parties to be able to go to the electorate and be able to canvass for support. It is protected by the Constitution. Now, the issue of the context is quite critical. And then that's why some of the political parties and some of the candidates have resorted to social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, to use those platforms to try to reach to the constituents. But that context is also limited by the fact that not every person in South Africa has got access to data. So in order to be able to access that information, there is a limitation. A political party might have the capacity to be able to pump information in social media, but that information remains irrelevant for as long as it does not actually reach the intended people. So you'll find that largely it is the middle class that have got access to information on social media, that ordinary people, they've got to be able to evaluate whether to go and buy data or to go and buy bread. And then therefore, the context that we're talking about is the context that is where we're supposed to be protecting that individual and be able to ensure that their rights are not unnecessarily curtailed by the fact that they do not have access to particular resources. But yes, indeed, political parties have got to learn to use a new media, new environment to be able to go to the electorate, but we've got to be realistic about access of people to new forms of communication that are there. For as long as also government does not make data freely available to the electorate, it is always going to be a tool that is used by the middle class. And overwhelming majority of people in the rural areas, for them, competition, as I've suggested, is whether when you've got 10 rands, you are going to be using that 10 rands to go and buy data, or whether you're going to be using that 10 rands to go and buy bread. So it's an important element.
Let me put this proposition to you. In one of the submissions that we've received, as you know, we've received overwhelming submissions. We have been given data of mobile phone penetration in our country. It sits in the early to mid 90s. In other words, it is as high as like 93, 94% of adults who have access to a handset. How do you say that might? It's obviously those who argue that the limitation is not, those who argue that the limitation is not truly only middle class in nature. It's not a class limitation. And they say, well, 93% of adult South Africans have phones. We can debate whether smartphones or not, but they have a capacity of messaging. And two, they add that the limitation is on everybody. We can go to gatherings now. I think we're going to go there very shortly. Because the number of submissions and people who want the elections to be postponed say, well, we can't even gather, so we can't message. And I'm trying to test that proposition, obviously, with you, who's an independent practitioner in the field. How do we deal with that? Particularly because on solid medical evidence or at least data, this pandemic will be with us for quite a while. So how are we going to message? Elections in 2024, elections now or deferred. Even if you defer them, how are you going to message in a way that frees itself from class limitations?
Justice, when you look at quite a number of areas, if you go to Johannesburg, for instance, and then, sorry, I've just emerged from
You're fine.
COVID.
Yes. No, you don't have to apologize at all. No, you're fine.
Okay, thank you. If you go to Johannesburg now,
and that's why we're here. It's COVID that brought us to this inquiry. Yes.
If you go to Johannesburg now, or certain parts of Tshwane, there is Wi-Fi freely available to the residents of those areas.
Yes.
So there needs to be a program that will also allow overwhelming majority of people to have access to Wi-Fi in the long run. People in rural areas must also be able to have free access to Wi-Fi. So the fact that my mother can buy data now and has got a phone, it does not mean that my mother is actually going to be using that data to try to find the messaging of a political party. She will probably use that data to try to communicate with people that is supposed to communicate with. So the people who came here and said that data penetration in South Africa is very high, it could be true. But here we're talking about whether in the context of the elections, ordinary people will actually use that information to try to access information and messaging of political parties when there are such many competing interests within the society, with the level of poverty that we have. So I'm suggesting, Justice Moseneke, that perhaps in terms of dealing with that particular aspect, there's got to be also a rollout by municipalities, government, Department of Communication, of free data through Wi-Fi in many parts of South Africa, so that people can actually be able to access the information.
Yeah, but assuming there was no pandemic, that wouldn't alone be a reason for postponing elections, isn't it? Because presumably, let me put it this way, not everybody goes to rallies. Not everybody listens to political messaging. But of course you have the right to hear the message if you chose, and you have the right to convey the message if you want to reach people. So the other arguments in the submissions are there is never a universal access in messaging. It's unfair to require it under COVID pandemic when in fact it never is there, because people choose whether or not to listen to political messaging, and not all parties message effectively. And so that's the one question. Let me park it there. The other one is, what about radio and broadcasting? What do you suggest ought to happen to increase political messaging?
Perhaps let me start with the second one, because it is part of my recommendations.
Oh, okay. And you can go to it when it's convenient, by the way.
Yes.
It's just issues that, because I know the submissions, I've seen so many, so I'm trying to test them with you, who knows the field quite well. Yeah.
I've suggested two important aspects in terms of that. One is that community radio stations must be supported in order for them to be able to help in terms of information dissemination. You've got quite a number of these community radio stations. Some of them are struggling, and therefore the majority of people still have access to those stations, and I'm suggesting that they should actually be used as another tool in the armory of basically information dissemination. The second aspect that I have recommended is that there is a need to engage ICASA as well in terms of allocation of slots for political messaging, so that it does not only, for instance, the current criteria that they're using political parties that are registered that are represented in Parliament, and then give them access according to representation that they actually have in Parliament. I think they've got some kind of a criteria that they're using that is similar to that. So what about the political parties that don't have access, that are not there represented in Parliament? New formations are coming up, and it is important that therefore ICASA begins to review the criteria that they're using to try to see how can they also be part of a solution to the current crisis that we have.
Yeah, to complicate your life a little bit, Mr. Tselane, I've been talking to the Chief Electoral Officer, like this in his submissions. Do you still remember how many parties are registered for local government elections? I know you've retired some time ago from the IEC, but perhaps to give the nation an idea, have you kept track with the current number?
Yes, I have.
402. 402. I was told, I hope I have the number right, but I think I do, because we had to, this inquiry had to send invitations to all of them. So I signed that many letters. Thanks God they can be signed electronically to different leaders of these parties. How do we divvy it up? How do we cut it up with ICASA and with community stations?
Fortunately, not all the political parties that are registered contest elections. Many that are registered. In fact, the Commission from time to time reviews the number of political parties that are registered and checks whether those political parties are still in existence, and then sends out notification of deregistration to political parties. So the fact that we've got so many political parties in the history of South Africa, not even half of them actually participate in the elections. Some of them, as I've said, they don't participate at all in the elections. They don't register to participate in the elections. And I think it's a wonderful thing that there are certain mechanisms that the IEC puts in place for a party to participate in the elections. And therefore, that could actually be a prohibition from having almost every political party participating in the electoral process. So, ICASA, in looking into that, would only have to develop a framework for those particular parties that would have registered to participate in the process. And as I've suggested, there are always very, very few. But because some of them are also regional, the way that information is going to be done, for instance, you could find one political party that is just contesting one ward. Of course, it does not mean that that particular party must be given national or access to national media when it does not actually need the national media to be able to communicate. It's got to find a way of communicating. It might want to use a community radio station that is located in that particular area to communicate.
Yes. Thank you, but just before we leave all this detail, we'll be touching out of detail, but here's the importance of all of it, is this. The challenge to political communication alone, could that be a reason for postponing elections?
No, it can't be the only consideration. And then hence, in my submission, I mentioned quite a number of things. Firstly, we've got to think about the electorate and whether the electorate has got access to information. How do they get that information? If traditional methods through which they've been getting information have been curtailed and it can no longer be used, what other methods are going to be used so that an electorate or a voter can actually be able to make an informed choice? As I've suggested earlier on, the elections are actually not even about the political parties. Political parties are just a conduit
Yes.
For the expression of the will of the people. The issue is, how is that will of the people going to be expressed when you've got limited information or limited access to information and you cannot actually be able to differentiate between different political parties or candidates? So it is important that we try to create multiplicity of platforms in order for a person to be able to find information, so that those who want to participate in the elections at least have got access to information and they can be able to differentiate between different political candidates and political parties.
Sure, thanks.
Now that I'm done with the integrity wheel, and I've suggested that this integrity wheel essentially captures all aspects that are important for the integrity of the elections, and integrity of the election determine the freeness and the fairness of the elections. And I'm not going to go through each and every element because I think I've explained them. Now I go to the role of the Commission. The role of the Commission, as I suggested earlier on, is to manage the elections at national, provincial, municipal, and legislative bodies, ensure that those elections are free and fair, and declare the results of those elections, and also compile voters. Now, when the Commission provides, as they eloquently did yesterday, their level of preparation, I think it is wonderful. And it is expected of the Electoral Commission because the first mandate for them is to manage and to organize and administer the elections. So the IEC must always be ready to deliver the elections. Even when I was still part of this organization, I kept on saying, in case there is a referendum, we must always be ready at the technical level to be able to deliver those elections. But the question now is the second one, is whether the current, which is that of ensuring free and fair elections. And as I've indicated, ensuring free and fair elections involves a multiplicity of players. It's not just a sole responsibility of the IEC. Political parties have suggested they've got the responsibility of having to mobilize people, having to teach people, having to make sure community-based organizations, civic organizations have got the responsibility of educating through civic education, through voter education, and many other programs that they would have. Media also has got an important role. The question therefore is, not only IEC at the technical level has got to be ready, as I suggested. But whether, firstly, IEC can confidently say that they can ensure that these elections are free and fair within the context of the pandemic. And whether all other players that are supposed to be playing a role in ensuring free and fair elections can actually be able to come in and say, indeed, the conditions exist for us to be able to have free and fair elections.
And that's the debate, isn't it?
It is the debate.
Yeah, they acknowledge that they need this inquiry because there is a debate there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Parts of our nation have submitted not, they won't be free and fair. Another part has submitted they will be free and fair.
Yes. But I think it is important to indicate that even the step that was taken by the Commission yesterday to approach the Electoral Court to extend or to postpone the by-election, it is because the Electoral Commission understands that it is not possible under certain conditions to have free and fair elections. And then these by-elections within the current environment of COVID and the lockdown and the restrictions that have been imposed, it will not be possible to have the elections, the by-elections. Now, already there is an agreement within the society, including from the side of the IEC, that the storm that we are going through this pandemic makes it difficult for certain rights to be exercised. And therefore, just based on this context, as the Constitutional Court has said that we must look at the context in defining the freeness and fairness of the elections. It shall appear to me that a case can be made that because there is an agreement in the society that we are going through the most difficult period, some kind of arrangements should be made to be able to accommodate the lives of people, but at the same time without compromising the democratic project that we're busy with. And I'm going to be suggesting just now in the conclusion.
Yes.
Some of the
I'm going to, yes, indeed, I'm going to ask you to go there because our time is running out. But I just want to say very quickly that I have read your written submissions about the power to postpone when you are faced with a legal impossibility, i.e. when elections cannot be free and fair. And you argue, I think quite eloquently, that that power is ever present. Some argue, yes, the power is present only within the framework of 5 years, 90 days, say in this case. But you argue that that power, constitutional power, exists even beyond the framework of 5 years, 90 days. That was how I read your submissions. Do you want to say something briefly there? And then to the conclusion, because we actually are running out of time. But I'm taking you back to something that you've already argued, maybe adequately on paper.
Thank you very much, Justice. Now, let's go back to, I'm trying to check the section of the Constitution.
Maybe I shouldn't bother you and take you back there. I've read your written submissions, and I have them, and I'll be putting them to other people to hear what they say. They have their fascinating end, but I would maybe I shouldn't take you there. Maybe I should take you to your way forward, rather than.
Yes.
Because the time has just run out. I have another submissions coming very shortly.
Then I'm going to quickly go there, but I just wanted to say that if you look again in the provision that talks about the term of office of a municipality being 5 years, the question becomes, what happens in a situation where now you extend that particular term of a municipality? Obviously, there's got to be certain constitutional arrangements that are going to be made to do so. But the provision under that says a municipal council remains competent until another election has taken place and people have actually been elected. So for as long as there is no election and there is no one who has been elected to replace the people who are in a particular municipality, the Constitution tells us that that council still remains competent. But let me quickly go to my conclusion.
Yes.
I have spoken about the context, and therefore there's no need for me to go through that again. I'm just going to focus on the way forward. I have suggested that we should consider postponing the elections to May 2022, and that the IC staff and temporary electoral staff should be prioritized for vaccination, that ICASA must be drawn in to help with the messaging of political messaging. Community radio stations should be supported, and I said prioritize the vaccination of vulnerable groups in order to be able to address the issue that I raised earlier on here of fear of the pandemic. And then I said consider postponing the registration for the weekend of 17 and 18 July. The reason why this is so important, Justice Moseneke, is because elections don't take place on the 27th of October. It is voting that happens on the 27th of October. Election is a process. And technically, I would say that elections, the preparation for the elections actually start with the announcement of the date of the elections. Even though from the side of the Commission, obviously you've got to do certain things well in advance. But after the date has been announced, and I've suggested that elections are won and lost during registration. So right now, gatherings are prohibited. We go into registration. The Electoral Commission, just for us, one registration we can spend almost 400 million. It doesn't have the resources. If these elections, if your recommendation then say postpone the elections, they do not have the resources to have another registration weekend. And the registration weekend, it's a key drive for many processes in the elections. For instance, after the registration weekend, a few days thereafter, there's got to be a proclamation. I've submitted the election timetable or draft election timetable to indicate milestones that have got to be achieved in preparation for the election day or the voting day. So your submission is supposed to be on the 24th to the commission. Registration happens on the 17th and 18th. Elections, as I've suggested, are won or lost during registration. What are the possibilities that this registration, because the commission, if the elections are postponed, say to early next year, the commission will not have the resources to have another registration again.
You say registration weekend, from your past experience, would cost
around
400 million.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any further submissions?
No further.
We've had the benefit, the fortune of your written submissions as well as your slides and your submissions today, and these have been extremely helpful. Please do be assured that we are listening as you drop every single word, and it is actually recorded and will be available to me again before we make the final decision. Please be well, gain your energy back, and see you have it back anyway. We wish you well, yes. So our next presentation is from AISA, the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa. Should I again go on Zoom to connect that way? Where's the technical stuff? Is that the best way to do it? Would it be? Okay. There won't be an echo, huh?
Yeah.
In your timetable, guys, I can see that we need at least 10-15 minutes before we get to the next presentation, right?
No, Judge.
You have
ISA
it.
is next. ISA is next. 12.
Yes, I'm saying when you do your programs,
Yes.
allow for 15 minutes for the transition.
Yes, yes, Judge.
This one is date 11:30, and then that
Next.
12:30, you know what I mean?
Yes.
So you become late inevitably. We just allow some breathing space at least to connect and et cetera, et cetera. This is the new link, Catherine. No. But I see you sent me something just now saying new link. Should I go to the same link that I had this afternoon, this morning?
Did you receive an email from someone at the IEC with a new link?
I thought that was from you.
No, I haven't sent you, but I sent you one from my IEC email and one from my Gmail because it was delayed. So today I haven't sent anything new. Sorry, Jeff.
Okay, thanks.
I'm just calling to say that we're now getting
Good afternoon. Is anybody there? Is anybody from ISA there? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Justice Moseneke. Can you hear me?
I can hear you indeed, Mr. Masterson. I can see and hear you. I hope you can see and hear me. Good afternoon to you all. I can see that there are 6 participants besides 5 besides you. Mr. Masterton, good afternoon to you. Just would like to apologize for a little late start. But the way presentations go, they tend to overflow a little bit from time to time. But I'm really most grateful for your presence here. And I look forward to your graphic presentations. And indeed, I also have your written submissions. And both I've looked at and I welcome.
Thank you very much, Justice. I appreciate the opportunity to talk.
I hope we're doing fine. It says network bandwidth low. I hope we are doing fine. We're able to talk to each other. Are you able to hear me? I hope we're quite happy and ready to listen to you and to your presentation if you are ready, and thanks for agreeing to do it.
Is the screen visible?
The screen is visible. I can see everything on it. Oral submissions, ISA 29th June 2021. So I'm quite ready when you are ready. And the presentation is in front of us. I can see it. And I welcome you and invite you to make your presentation. I need no long introduction. The issues are quite clear from your own presentation, and you have a full grasp of them. And thanks for the presentation. Are you there? You may proceed as soon as you are ready. Mr. Masterton, are you ready? Are you able to go ahead? Yeah. There's some bandwidth issue there. I don't know what it is.
I hear the judge perfectly. I'm not able to.
Yes, I can hear you too. Can you hear me?
Should I try and reconnect?
Yes, but I can hear you quite clearly, and I can see your slide. So you may try to reconnect if it's more convenient.
Good afternoon, Justice. Are you able to hear me again?
Good afternoon. I can see you. I can hear you. And I'm ready to listen to you.
Sorry about that.
No problem at all.
Let's try again. Apologies for the delay. I trust that is audible
Yes,
and visible.
that's audible and visible. I can see the submissions on my screen. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So ISA is a election observation and management body that assists electoral commissions across the continent in various aspects to do with managing elections. We perform observer missions in Africa and beyond, and we perform various other services with respect to the holding of elections and other democratic processes. And we really do appreciate the opportunity to make this submission today. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. The first aspect we wanted to highlight here was the issue of readiness to hold the elections. From that perspective, I think it has been said on several occasions to yourself, both in the written submissions and in the oral submissions thus far, that the IEC is on record that they are confident that they have prepared technically to conduct these elections. And that's a very important aspect of this. The IEC is expressing confidence in its preparations to hold elections on the gazetted date of 27 October.
Yes.
The second point, of course, that has been made is that the IEC has held more than 100 by-elections since the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, and they have been satisfied with how those by-elections have proceeded. This is another important point to reflect upon. And then I think the third point that I drew from the submissions that I looked through from this report on the medical side, and then we are not a medical body, so we don't weigh in on the medical efficacy of the submissions, but we found it interesting that the medical advice that we see highlights that the precautions that can be taken to mitigate the coronavirus pandemic have not changed since the outbreak began. The same precautions that existed at the outset are still the same precautions. So when we take these three facts together, then ISA believes that under such conditions, we believe the IEC is ready to hold the elections. And that's an important first step.
Of course, Mr. Masterton, on the third point, this morning I was listening to health scientists. They point to what has changed has been the variants, alpha, beta, delta, and they've presented before me slides that show the levels of infections, the levels of mortality, not only province by province, but nationally. So that seems to be ever changing. In other words, getting more with every wave. And of course, variedly in different provinces. Is there anything you want to say about that? That there is some constancy in the response, and yet there is a difference in the intensity.
Yes, so I think that, as I said, we are not a body that deals in the medical aspects of this pandemic. We are focused very much on what measures do the medical experts recommend be put in place to protect the officials who are conducting the elections, as well as the voters themselves, even political party agents who might find themselves at polling stations. What are the precautions that are available to us to increase the safety of all concerned? And so from that perspective, whilst the variants have changed, their names have changed, and their countries of origin have changed, etc., we have noted that the same precautions of good sanitation, wearing masks, and ensuring social distancing have been constant throughout, and that these remain the most effective measures that we have available to us right now to slow and to prevent the transmission of the disease. So from that perspective, that is what we are noting from the submission.
Yes, no, thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you very much. We wanted to, in our presentation, look at two elements of the discussion, primarily those two because we feel that those are very important, and that as ISA we have something to weigh in on those two particular elements. The first one is to evaluate the idea of a postponement in an election, and then the second one we will focus on will be on campaigning and the extent to which campaigning and the limitations on campaigning will be a problem for the democratic nature and the freeness and fairness of an election. So let me start with the idea of postponement. The possibility of a postponement exists, and I think that there have been good submissions, including the one by Mr. Terry Talani just made previous to this presentation, on the manner in which the Constitution allows for postponement under certain conditions, and we tend to agree with that. A postponement is legally possible, and that the processes exist for a postponement to be made. We have a concern, however, over the underlying assumption of making a postponement in order to try and anticipate or predict a more ideal time into the future for when an election might be suitable. Now, we don't view this as realistic or feasible based on 18 months of experience observing elections under the COVID pandemic. And I think to the point that you just made earlier, that there have been significant variances and significant changes in the nature of this pandemic over time. So we are recognizing the extreme variance that occurs and the difficulty that anyone, including the best medical experts we have available, in predicting the future path of this particular pandemic. And so as such, we view the exercise of trying to postpone at this point in anticipation of a better time at some future moment, an extremely risky exercise. So we view that as potentially problematic. So there is the possibility that we may get lucky and a postponement would allow for us to fall within a much safer period in the future, but it may just as easily not occur.
Yeah, you're saying
Postponement may or may not achieve that.
you say there is no sweet spot that can be medically or scientifically predicted.
Into the future, exactly. So if we were to say postpone for an arbitrary period of 3 months or an arbitrary period of 12 months, there is no way to predict what the trajectory of this virus looks like 3 or 12 months ahead of us at this stage. And one of the risks are exactly the same spot in 12 months' time, having postponed the elections, or potentially we may even be in a worse situation as well. So there is a better environment within which the elections can take place. As to the other concern that we have relating to postponement, we have looked at countries that have opted into the postponement idea, that have postponed elections during the pandemic falls or the hospital bed occupancy rates, etc. And one of the things that we have noticed is that countries that adopt a single postponement, there have been a high number of those countries that have then gone on to adopt a second and third further postponements at a later date. In other words, those countries that said, we will postpone looking for a more suitable opportunity to conduct our elections, have in actual fact found that when they arrive at the new postponed date, they feel it is necessary or in some way justifiable to postpone again further. And so once this option of postponement has been put on the table and the country has opted to postpone, and there have been several countries, examples that I could cite to you. Ethiopia is one. The English and Scottish local by-elections have also been postponed for a period of 12 months and now are being postponed again. And so we are seeing across the world countries that enter into this idea of postponing have subsequently postponed again for the time. So whilst we might sit here and look at a postponement as a single incident, a single event, the possibility of seeing further postponements becomes more likely the more often that we do it. And for this reason, we view the idea of a postponement as somebody, the ability that we are dealing with here and the uncertainty of the forward trajectory of the virus makes any kind of predictiveness. The elections are not safe under the current conditions. We have also established a benchmark or
You've established a benchmark.
A measuring level at which
Yeah, the connection is a bit compromised, Mr. Masterson. There's a bit of a fluctuation in the connectivity. I hope it gets better, because I want to hear I'm much interested in the submission.
I'm so sorry about that. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, it is better now. It tends to go up and down. It fluctuates. A little like the pandemic. I think it is doing... Yes.
I'm so sorry about that. We will proceed.
Please do.
So yes, the issue is that the moment that a country enters into the idea that we will postpone the elections because at this moment we do not view the elections as being safe and that they can be held in a democratic manner, you have established a precedent. And at a future date, when you review the election date that is now coming up for the second time, having been postponed, you can then evaluate, has the conditions improved significantly from when we would have originally held the election?
Of course, Mr.
Then, as you create this precedent, is then going to be open to further speculation. And this is why we see more postponements occurring in countries that have entered into this postponement sort of approach.
Of course, Mr. Masterson, I just wanted to, sorry to interrupt you there and say, of course the argument is a powerful one for a kind of pro-democratic project positioning. On the other hand, I've heard submissions that say you have to choose a sport where you will do the least, you're likely to do the least harm to life and limb. And that is why we're having this debate. You know, shouldn't I be looking for a sport which is likely to do the least harm? Let me give you an example. A sport where, for instance, the level of vaccination coverage in the country is at a point where the harm will be the least. Why is that not a valid consideration when you weigh whether or not to postpone? If you're going to have community immunity, in 3 months, 6 months from now on, why would that not be a sweet spot? In other words, a spot where the United Kingdom is, if I were to use them as an example again, where people get infected, but the mortality rate has dropped substantially. And you can compare that with India, where they went to elections and people died. So I'm saying, why shouldn't I weigh both sides? The undesirability of repeated postponements against an attempt to save lives.
So thank you for that question, Justice. And I think it's of course an important one. In our written submission, we recognized that these are two sets of rights that have to be held very much in complementary fashion. And we are not at all in our argument suggesting the primacy of one set of rights over the other. If our submission appears to be weighted very, very heavily on the democratic side, that's purely because we don't want to speak about that which we know very little. So we rely on the medical experts to tell us what they can predict going forward, what their confidence is in the efficacy of vaccines. We rely on organizations that have made submissions to this panel to talk about the medical efficacy and to talk about those medical rights. And we are guided by those. We have listened very carefully, not just in South Africa, but in every country that has held elections. We have listened to those experts and their views, and we do continue to take those views very seriously. So we are simply sharing the perspective from our level of expertise. We understand the principles on the democratic side. But we absolutely believe in the value of holding these two sets of rights in tension. And so from our perspective, we do think it's a very, very challenging discussion to have. We are not, in absolute terms, ruling out a postponement in South Africa. We view it as one option, and we, in our conclusions, do actually speak to that. And we make a recommendation as far as that's considered. But we can't, with any degree of expertise, speak to the efficacy of vaccines into the future, etc.
Thank you. I understand that. Thanks for your response.
Thank you very much. All right. In which case, I'm then going to allow my colleague Sandile Kuboni. I hope he's able to have better connection issues than I have. And he's going to weigh in on, I think, the key issue that we wanted to zero in on, which is the campaign period. So Sandile, if you're available, I hope that you can hear me and you can take over.
Thanks for those submissions.
Perhaps the IT people can assist with making Sandile available to...
Yes, we're going to ask them to do that. Technical team, there is Sandile who seeks to speak to us. Shall we see him and hear him? Sabona Sandile, are you visible, audible? No. Are you able to detect somebody trying to come in, technical team? And if so, shall we allow him so that we can hear his submissions, please?
When I began my submission, Sandile was with us, so I don't know what's happened.
Is he visible on the network? They're trying to call him to see if... Oh, Sandile is saying yes. From Sandile to all panelists. So are you here? Please do unmute yourself so that we can have a discussion.
So I see Sandile is as an attendee in the current...
I see. Can we allow him in as an attendee?
As a panelist.
As a panelist. Please do. Of course, the platform is carrying quite a number of attendees. So it's an attempt, Mr. Assistant, to regulate it from this end, allow people to hear and see without themselves getting into the discussion as yet.
No, that's understood. I appreciate that.
I've just asked the team to let him in so that we can hear him out. Of course, time is indeed of the essence. We're having several submissions coming up this afternoon from 2 o'clock, so I hope we'll be able to have Sunday come through. And if he doesn't, I'm afraid you may have to make the submissions in relation to the campaigns issue.
Yeah, we can proceed if we can give them 1 minute, and then perhaps then I can just simply
Yes.
share on Sandile's behalf.
Have we found Sandile's attendee, and are we able to let him in, please? What is Sandile's last name? Mr. Masterson?
Kuboni. Sandile Kuboni.
Sandile Kuboni.
All right, Justice, I see he's not managed to join us yet. So allow me to continue, if you don't mind. So
Yes, please do continue. I am certainly like to hear you on this aspect. As you know, it remains important, and it's part of an important argument for those who seek a postponement. Please proceed.
So the campaign period, I think, forms the basis of a significant number of the submissions to this report, particularly from political parties. And as you know, ISA is an organization that conducts a lot of observation, and we observe these campaign periods very, very keenly. The forms of campaigning that involve the highest risk in terms of the campaign period would include all face-to-face activities and group gatherings, which are typically very traditional forms of campaigning and the forms of campaigning that political parties pursue most actively as you approach an election, to either engage with people in one-on-one face-to-face engagements, or to gather in groups at town hall meetings or rallies or marches to mobilize support and to create some energy for the party. And so, of course, the key question is, if restrictions are placed on political parties during their campaigning, does this impact on conditions that are conducive to free and fair elections? This is directly a quote from the IEC Electoral Code of Conduct itself. There is, of course, another important question that needs to be asked as well, which is the intersection of the adherence to lockdown regulations when it comes to political activities around campaigning. So, for example, what is the response of the IEC, or what is the response of the police forces if a political party fails to adhere to gazetted regulations in the pursuance of a campaign activity? Typically, the Constitution views these activities in terms of election campaigning as not a set of protected activities, but a set of special activities that are governed by. And so how does that intersection also need to be handled? Because it would be, I think, quite regulations to be seen to be broken. Challenging issue for the IEC to handle as well. I see that Sandile has joined us, so perhaps if I can find out if Sandile is available now.
Oh, yes, I can see that. If you could ask him to, I'm sure he'll unmute himself.
Yes, good morning.
Sabon, are you here?
So,
Yapile Raroto.
I Sapila Njan.
No, Siapila. Grand Master has already started Kuluma, but you're at large to make your points. Our time is ticking away, and
yes,
he was dealing with forms of campaigning and its impact, the pandemic's impact on forms of campaigning. Please go ahead.
So, as maybe he has alluded, we've identified some key events as relating to elections, as it been said before, that it's just not the voting day that is important. So the campaign period, again, is one of those important events, and potentially, if not necessarily regulated, maybe a super spreader. But we've seen over the years that there's been a natural move sort of from the parties to mix the traditional methods of campaigning, like your face-to-face interactions, or uses the physical methods to a more sort of online and utilizing other platforms. This was before COVID. And in most elections that we've seen during the pandemic time, political parties have actually utilized the other method. So already a sort of a natural move toward other methods. So now coming here, that is just a background. But now coming here, that when you are restricting, are we essentially calling for restrictions to political parties, or are we calling for maybe regulations? Are these regulation or restrictions anti-democratic? We as ISA, we are saying no, they not, because already political parties have certain regulations that are provided by the Constitution, also the electoral code that they sign, that has mainly what is permissible for parties and what is not. And COVID restrictions by themselves, they do not interfere or say parties may not necessarily introduce new language to what is already in the what is already to them. For instance, when you are speaking, people are wearing masks. It's what is applied to the COVID. It's not a new regulation to what the code of conduct says. So you're just limiting the number. And again, when you're looking at the events that are more likely to, during the campaign, that are more likely to be called the super spreader events, they are just a niche to what the entire campaign is all about.
Well, Sandile, let's pause for a while and debate that. It may be too widely stated. Political messaging, is political messaging not an important part of the freeness of the elections? Agunjalo, I mean, you can attract people only if you can convey your political position. So political messaging, and the second part, then you can answer both. Some people have come here and submitted that no, but Usandile ukhuluma nge-middle class method of communication. Ideas of, ideas of data, electronic communication suits perfectly well for middle class people. Okay? But many people don't have data. We know that the penetration of handsets is very high in South Africa, as high as up to like 93%. But maybe the data users are much lower than that 93%. So I want some responses from you about that. Just start. The third thing I think you can then give us a complete answer is, of course, when you say to people they may not gather, you are saying to them they may not broadcast their message in a traditional way. That's really what you are saying to them, Mangiti. you can't, if you say you can't go to church, you say to people you may not pray the traditional way. You are saying something important. And is that restriction, does that restriction go to free and fair or not? To free, let's leave the fair alone, to free. It might flow into fair also. Let me leave you there. I've raised 3 questions and please feel free to deal with them as you choose.
Yes. Okay. Firstly, let's say the traditional versus maybe the new methods of doing things under the new normal. So, as I've already alluded to the fact that even before COVID, political parties had been using other methods like your radio, which is less human interaction, obviously. Print newspapers, they've been using those methods as maybe a vehicle to convey their political messages. So political messaging is important during campaigning, but it doesn't solely rely to a more face-to-face interaction. So you have, if you may see, maybe you've been observing over the years, a political party would have maybe 10 rallies, but the 10 rallies would be also supported by your radio campaign that would be here every day. We'd also now, because, and there'd be maybe TV campaign, there'd be now Facebook messaging, there'd be Twitter messaging. Parties have been using that to support the also the physical campaigning. And when you see the physical campaigning, it also, again, people can join in. You can have, let's say, in the rural area, you can have a permitted 50 number of people, and then give access via a link that you normally you can share with other delegates. If, for instance, there's a provision for a data, again, the political parties are saving, because renting a space and also providing a data for your delegate could be maybe we can weigh in on the cost-benefit side and say what is more expensive actually. Is it holding the physical, be at the physical space? For instance, if you were to rent out a stadium, how much would you cost typically for an election at the stadium to hold 50 people, or maybe have a 50 people that you give data to, and then also, hold maybe another 50 people at the stadium. In that way, you have covered 100 people, because even at the stadium, in your physical interactions, you may have people that are going to be present inside, but what about the people that can't access the stadium? And automatically, your messaging is limited to the people only at the stadium.
Yeah, you are really,
we are proposing.
If I interrupt you, you are really saying that conventional methods of canvassing are not a precondition for free and fair elections.
Yes.
And you say people must evolve and find new ways of doing that.
Yes.
I can hear the point. Thanks. Do you want to make other points on that? Of course, you know, and you'll hear later submissions, people who feel very strongly that they don't have the money to be able to do the digital canvassing, and maybe the future might demand otherwise, but for now, we should consider that.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
So, when the COVID regulations, we note that the only problem we would have with the parties or the stakeholders, because they are important stakeholders in the elections, that when the regulations are not applied reasonably, fairly, and they do not seem to be applied across the board to all parties, then and equally, that's when you'd have a problem. But in all fairness, all parties have tried to blend the traditional and the new methods even before COVID. So the campaigning is not for us a big it's not a concern that should maybe allow for election to be postponed.
Well, I don't know the reasons for it, but you would have heard that as soon as the president announced all those restrictions, the IEC rushed to court and said they thought they can't conduct local government elections anymore. I don't work at the IEC, I'm not privy to the decision. What is your view about that? That if you shut down all forms of meetings and you shut down interprovincial movement and so on, do you think that is a good climate in which to hold elections?
Well, essentially you have the local government are mainly localized, and for instance, when you're taking also some important events like registration, the IEC already has in place avenues for online registration that you update your details online, and a lot of people have been using and they've been privy to that avenue even before the pandemic. So you can update it, you can tell the IEC where you are at a particular time, or you can actually, so there's no need for you to travel to another province for a registration, for instance. So a registration can still happen even during COVID, because if you are in Joburg from KZN, for instance, you would update that I'm no longer in KZN, I'm in Joburg under this ward, so you'd be permitted to vote at that ward. Already we have those systems in place.
Yes, I'll just say that there are some people who live in Joburg and vote in KZN, people and vice versa, in Jalonjala. But I've had the submissions. I must ask you respectfully to go to your conclusions and recommendations. Our time has run out. So I ask that you perhaps, I have the slides before me, and as well as your submissions in writing, and I urge you to go to conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you very much, Justice. I'll very quickly go through these. They are in our written submission as well. We find no evidence that the elections that have been held, more than 130 elections under COVID conditions since March last year, have necessarily led to any catastrophic consequences. There have been elections which we have seen post-election surges and loss of life, as you alluded to, India, which is obviously a key concern to monitor and track. But there is no established causality that every time you hold an election, you see a post-election surge. From this, we determined that the key elements that will determine whether or not the elections, should they go ahead, will have a detrimental impact to the health of South Africans in large numbers will very much depend on the behavior of political parties, of other stakeholders, and voters and officials on voting day itself. We did highlight already the issue of postponement, and our concerns with opening the door to postponement opens the door to further postponement itself. But we also want to recognize that there is a broader debate in South Africa right now about whether or not the local government elections should not just be postponed and absorbed into national and provincial elections at a later date. And we view the value of local government elections and the way in which South Africa's constitution affirms local government elections to be standing on their own as a valuable principle and one that ISA wants to support. If I may, then we have those recommendations that I alluded to. Our recommendation, predictably, given our submission, is that we view that the elections can proceed as planned, as long as all available precautions are applied, which the IEC has indicated they are ready to do. In the event that this report recommends a postponement, we accept that that is the legitimate outcome of the report and the analysis. Then we recommend an absolute commitment to ensure that that postponement is limited and confined, and that you don't attach preconditions to the future holding of the local government polls. This was the concern that I highlighted earlier. The moment that you establish a benchmark which needs to be satisfied before you can hold elections, you run the risk of never holding these elections, and that would definitely not be in South Africa's interests. And so the recommendations are in front of you there. You have our report, and we really do appreciate the opportunity to submit to you this morning. Thank you very much, Justice.
Thank you ever so much. I'm most grateful to ISA. I'm grateful to both, to you, gentlemen. Excuse me. And these are available. They fit in and fall into the debate and the discussion that country is having as we speak. And somebody was saying that in itself is valuable on its own, because it suddenly sharpens our democratic consciousness, if you like, and our desire to protect what we have and to try and preserve it. But at the same time, of course, the call to do no harm, to ensure that there's no harm to life and limb. And so, yes, we are at that intersection that is so difficult. And you being experts in your field, it was truly necessary to hear you. And we really appreciate that. As you know, the report will be out thereabouts around the 21st of July. And we have taken heed of your recommendations. And the slippery slope argument doesn't escape me, that you don't change things like elections as you change your pair of sneakers. It's something a little more intricate than that. So thank you ever so much, and be well. I have quite a busy afternoon. I'm going to find something to grab Sandile and go back and work again in the afternoon. And you're welcome to listen, of course, you know, the streaming and all that if you want to hear more of the submissions. Ngiyabonga. Thank you ever so much. Take care.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you ever so much. This went well. This did well. We're going to need, that is pretty good. We checked for the last time. In the afternoon we're having politicals, right? We're having unions.
CSOs, Judge. We've got Active Citizens Movement.
Yes.
And then COSATU, the two unions, COSATU and NACTU.
And then HSF.
And then HSF.
Good. All good. We're going to listen. That'll be easier weightlifting, right?
Yes, Judge.
Because they don't pretend to be objective. They take positions. It makes life easier. They don't say maybe, maybe not. They say I'm standing here and this is what I want. So that tends to be an easier discussion. How we do with the transcription? Any chance?
I'm going to.
Okay. Guys, I'm going to go back to the office and have some coffee or something. You're free to walk about. I don't think we're going to meet at that. If there's any particular thing that you'd like to raise, we're starting at 2 o'clock. It's just 30 minutes. Hi, Tabang.
The letter to Pasadena.
Yeah, have you sent me the letter?
Yes, yes.
Oh my goodness, I switched off my computer and it is as low as the mountains. You want me to look at the letter? Is it open there?
Judge, I also had to restart. Here I am. It's okay, Catherine. No,
Have you got it? I'm happy to come and look at it there.
sure, I'm just starting up again, Judge. We'll be here in 2 minutes.
We're actually starting in 20 minutes, aren't we?
Yes.
I'll have to be more tight with the next lot, time-wise.
Thank you. And then the sound, so I'm just going to continue until just